Iran's Chief of Staff Major General Abdul Rahim Mousavi has issued one of the strongest military warnings Tehran has delivered since the June 2025 war. In a message marking Iran's Air Force Day, Mousavi said any military action against the Islamic Republic would end in what he called absolute and strategic defeat for Iran's enemies. His language was blunt and left no room for interpretation. Even a limited strike on Iranian soil would not remain localized. It would expand into a broader regional conflict, spreading instability far beyond Iran's borders and dragging multiple actors across the Middle East into a confrontation that no single power could control. The warning comes as U.S. forces have increased their military presence in the region. U.S. forces have surged into the region in recent weeks, deploying additional air and naval assets and openly signaling readiness for potential action. The USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier is positioned in the Arabian Sea off the coast of Iran, carrying the firepower necessary to execute the kind of strikes President Trump has repeatedly threatened. More THAAD air defense systems have been deployed at U.S. bases across the Middle East. Multiple guided missile destroyers capable of intercepting missiles and drones are now stationed in the region. F-15E fighter squadrons have been repositioned to Jordan, and US F-35 aircraft have recently transited through Europe toward the theater. Iranian officials have made it clear they view these deployments not as deterrence but as active preparation for a military operation. Mousavi emphasized that Iran's Army Air Force plays a central role in what he described as active deterrence. He said the force has undergone continuous modernization and now stands at its highest level of operational readiness, capable of responding rapidly to any threat or miscalculation. According to Iran's military leadership, that readiness is not symbolic. Mousavi stressed that Iran's response would be decisive and coordinated across all branches of the armed forces, designed to impose what he described as heavy and irreparable costs on both the attackers and their supporters. That final phrase is significant. When Mousavi says attackers and their supporters, he is signaling that Iran's retaliation would not be limited to American forces alone. Countries that host U.S. military installations, provide logistical support, or allow their territory or airspace to be used for operations against Iran could also face consequences. It is the same message that Foreign Minister Araghchi delivered in his Al Jazeera interview days earlier, when he said that Iran cannot hit U.S. soil but can and will strike where American forces are stationed. The military and diplomatic messaging are now fully aligned. Mousavi also referenced recent history as the basis for Iran's current posture. Iranian officials point to what they describe as the 12-day Israeli-American confrontation in June 2025, during which U.S. and Israeli forces carried out coordinated strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, according to multiple reports. Tehran says that conflict reshaped its defensive calculations entirely and reinforced the need for heightened readiness across every branch of the military. The lesson Iran drew from June 2025, according to its own officials, is that the next confrontation must be met with a response so costly that the calculus of attacking Iran changes permanently. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei echoed and amplified Mousavi's warning in recent days. In a public statement, Khamenei addressed President Trump directly. He said, according to Iranian state media, "This gentleman keeps claiming that we have brought warships to the region and done this or that. I think you shouldn't scare the Iranian nation with such things, as it won't be affected by such remarks. It doesn't fear rightful confrontation. We are not the instigators, and we do not seek to attack any country. But the Iranian nation will deliver a firm blow to anyone who attacks or harasses it." Khamenei then delivered the line that has drawn the most attention from regional and international analysts. He said, according to the same broadcast, "The Americans must be aware that if they wage a war this time, it will be a regional war." The statement is notable not only for its content, but for who is saying it. When Iran's supreme leader, the ultimate decision-maker on matters of war and peace, declares publicly that a U.S.-initiated conflict would become a regional war, it is not rhetoric. It is a strategic communication designed to be heard in Washington, in the Gulf capitals, and in every country hosting American troops. What a regional war would actually look like is something military analysts have been modeling for years, and the scenarios are catastrophic by every measure. Iran's network of allied groups stretches from Yemen to Iraq to Lebanon to Syria. The Houthis have already demonstrated their ability to disrupt global shipping by striking more than 100 vessels in the Red Sea. Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq has issued mobilization orders and carried out more than 170 attacks on U.S. forces between October 2023 and February 2024 alone, according to Pentagon reporting. Hezbollah in Lebanon, despite the damage it sustained in recent conflicts, retains significant missile capabilities. A regional war would activate all of these fronts simultaneously, creating a multi-axis threat that no single military force, no matter how powerful, can contain from a single theater of operations. The Strait of Hormuz adds an economic dimension that extends the consequences far beyond the Middle East. Approximately 20% of the world's oil passes through that waterway. Any disruption, even a partial one, would send energy prices soaring and destabilize global markets. Iran has repeatedly signaled that the strait would not remain open in a full-scale conflict, a threat that energy analysts and shipping companies take seriously given Tehran's demonstrated ability to interfere with maritime traffic. The timing of these military warnings is inseparable from the diplomatic track. The latest round of nuclear talks between the United States and Iran took place in Muscat, Oman, with both sides describing the exchanges as a starting point but acknowledging that fundamental differences remain unresolved. Foreign Minister Araghchi said the talks had a good start and described the atmosphere as positive, but cautioned that further progress depends on consultations in the capitals, language that diplomats interpret as meaning no substantive concessions were made by either side. What made the Muscat round different from previous sessions was a visible and deliberate change in the American delegation's composition. The United States brought its top military commander for the Middle East, U.S. Navy Admiral Brad Cooper, who sat in on the talks in his dress uniform. According to reporting from journalists present in Muscat, Admiral Cooper was the physical representation of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier stationed off Iran's coast with the firepower to carry out Trump's threats. His presence at a diplomatic meeting sent a message that was impossible to miss. The military option is not theoretical. It is sitting at the table. The decision to include a uniformed military commander in what was ostensibly a diplomatic meeting breaks with standard practice in nuclear negotiations. During the JCPOA talks that produced the 2015 deal, the American delegation was composed entirely of civilian diplomats and technical experts. The inclusion of Admiral Cooper signals a fundamentally different approach, one in which the military dimension is not kept separate from the diplomatic track, but integrated into it as a form of coercive leverage. For Iranian negotiators, who arrived expecting a continuation of the indirect format that characterized earlier rounds, the sight of a four-star admiral in dress whites across the table was not subtle. Araghchi himself has described the talks as indirect and strictly limited to the nuclear file, suggesting that the format involved Omani intermediaries passing messages between the two delegations rather than direct face-to-face discussions. But the physical proximity of Admiral Cooper and the Abraham Lincoln's firepower floating just offshore ensured that the military dimension was present in every exchange, whether spoken or unspoken. Iranian officials have publicly pushed back against what they describe as negotiation under the threat of force. Araghchi stated in his Al Jazeera interview that Iran's nuclear dispute can only be resolved through talks that are realistic, respectful, and free from threats or pressure. He said Tehran is prepared to reach what he called a reassuring agreement on enrichment, but warned that coercion will lead nowhere. Senior Iranian cleric Ahmad Khatami reinforced this position by declaring that Iran did not seek nuclear energy to build an atomic bomb and would not give up its nuclear program, adding that the country's opposition to nuclear weapons is based on religious principles. Araghchi also shut the door entirely on any discussion of Iran's missile capabilities. He declared that missile talks are impossible now or ever, a statement that directly contradicts Washington's insistence that any comprehensive deal must include Iran's ballistic missile program. For Tehran, the missile arsenal is the core of its national defense, the primary deterrent that compensates for the absence of a modern air force, and that prevents the kind of military superiority Iran views as the ultimate goal of American and Israeli strategy in the region. But whatever positive signals emerged from the Muscat meeting were immediately undercut by Washington's own actions. Just moments after the diplomatic session concluded, the Trump administration announced a fresh round of sanctions aimed squarely at Iran's oil lifeline. 14 vessels, 15 entities, and 2 individuals were targeted as part of what the administration calls its renewed maximum pressure campaign. The U.S. State Department said Iran's oil revenues are being used to fund destabilizing activities abroad and to intensify repression at home. Among the vessels sanctioned are ships flagged from Turkey, India, and the United Arab Emirates, all accused of transporting Iranian oil. The sanctions represent an acceleration of a strategy that began during Trump's first term, forcing all countries to stop buying Iranian oil. The targeting of vessels from Turkey, India, and the UAE is particularly significant because it signals Washington's willingness to impose costs on countries that are not adversaries but trading partners. Countries that in some cases are simultaneously engaged in diplomatic efforts to mediate between the United States and Iran. For Tehran, the message is unmistakable. Negotiations may continue, but economic pressure will not pause. Trump himself has added to the pressure with executive action. He signed an executive order imposing secondary sanctions through tariffs on countries importing Iranian goods and services, citing threats to U.S. national security. The order is designed to force major oil importers, particularly China, to choose between trading with Iran and maintaining access to the American financial system. Iranian officials have described this approach as economic warfare that targets not just Iran, but any country that maintains commercial ties with Tehran. The cumulative impact of these sanctions on Iran's economy has been severe. Iran's oil exports, which once exceeded 2 million barrels per day, have been significantly reduced, though the exact figures are disputed because much of Iran's remaining trade flows through unofficial channels and ship-to-ship transfers designed to evade detection. The Iranian rial has lost substantial value against the dollar. Inflation has remained in double digits for years, and the purchasing power of ordinary Iranians has been devastated. The December protests that shook the country were driven in large part by the economic consequences of sanctions, creating a feedback loop in which American pressure generates domestic unrest, which Washington then uses as additional leverage in the nuclear talks. For Iran's leadership, this dynamic represents a form of hybrid warfare designed to destabilize the country from within. They argue that the sanctions are not a tool of diplomacy, but a weapon aimed at regime change, and that negotiating under these conditions is fundamentally different from negotiating in good faith. This perspective helps explain why Tehran's positions have hardened rather than softened as pressure has increased. From the Iranian point of view, making concessions under maximum pressure would only invite more pressure, while standing firm preserves the possibility of negotiating from a position of resilience rather than capitulation. And then there is the fire. A building inside a military base at the heart of Tehran went up in flames amid the escalating tensions, producing images that went viral and sparked immediate panic among residents who suspected external involvement. Iran's semi-official news agency reported that the blaze broke out in a carpentry workshop inside the base, which is linked to Iran's military joint staff. The Iranian army said the fire was contained after firefighting teams responded quickly, with no injuries reported, and blamed an electrical fault. But the timing was impossible to ignore. The fire occurred as Trump was unleashing his toughest sanctions yet, and as military threats from Washington continued to intensify. Whether the fire was genuinely accidental or something more remains unclear, and Iranian authorities have offered no evidence beyond the official explanation of an electrical fault. But the incident illustrates the level of anxiety inside Iran and the degree to which the population is living in a state of heightened alert. When a fire breaks out at a military facility in the capital during a period of open threats from a foreign power, the first instinct of residents is not to assume an accident. It is to assume an attack. That psychological reality is itself a consequence of the pressure campaign, and it speaks to the toll that sustained military threats take on civilian populations even before a single shot is fired. The protests that erupted in late December over rising inflation and economic stagnation have added another dimension to the crisis. The demonstrations were some of the largest since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, spreading across multiple cities and drawing participation from a broad cross-section of Iranian society, from students and workers to merchants and professionals. The Iranian government responded with a security crackdown that drew international condemnation, including reports of mass arrests, detention of protest leaders, and according to some human rights organizations, executions of detained demonstrators, though the exact scale of the crackdown remains difficult to verify independently. The protests have given Washington an additional point of leverage. Trump has repeatedly indicated he could use military force if Iran does not stop mass executions or agree to a nuclear deal, effectively linking the domestic human rights situation to the nuclear negotiations. Tehran has rejected this linkage categorically, describing it as interference in internal affairs and arguing that the United States has no standing to lecture other countries on human rights, while simultaneously imposing sanctions that devastate civilian populations. Iranian officials have also accused Washington of attempting to exploit domestic unrest to weaken Iran's negotiating position, a charge that American officials deny. According to Axios, another round of talks between Washington and Tehran is expected within the next 13 days. But the trajectory of events suggests that the diplomatic window is narrowing rather than widening. Iran's military leadership is publicly warning that any strike will produce a regional war. Its supreme leader is telling Trump directly that the Iranian nation does not fear confrontation. Its foreign minister is refusing to discuss missiles and insisting that enrichment will continue, and the United States is responding with more sanctions, more military deployments, and an admiral in dress uniform at the negotiating table. Trump himself has been characteristically blunt about the stakes. When asked about potential military action against Iran, he told reporters, "We have a tremendous force going there, just like we did in Venezuela, even bigger, and they'll be there soon. And I'd like to see a deal negotiated. I don't know that that's going to happen, but if we can't, probably bad things would happen." The language is deliberately vague, but the implication is clear. Military action remains a live option, and the deployment of forces is not contingent on the outcome of diplomacy. It is happening regardless. Regional governments find themselves caught between these two positions. Gulf states have signaled through diplomatic channels that they have no interest in becoming collateral damage in a US-Iran conflict, according to regional reporting. Countries hosting major American installations, including Bahrain with the US Fifth Fleet, Qatar with Al Udeid Air Base, and Iraq with thousands of deployed troops, understand that Mousavi's warning about attackers and their supporters applies directly to them. The January 2020 strike on Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq, which caused traumatic brain injuries to dozens of American service members, demonstrated that Iran will target US positions on foreign soil when it considers its red lines crossed. The current warnings suggest that any future response would be significantly larger in scale. Saudi Arabia has maintained communication channels with Tehran brokered through China since the 2023 Beijing Agreement. Oman continues to serve as the primary intermediary between Washington and the Islamic Republic, and several Gulf states have signaled that they have no appetite for their territory to be used in operations against Iran, according to regional reporting. These are the positions of governments that have concluded the American security umbrella cannot protect them from the consequences of a regional war, and that independent diplomacy with Tehran is their best insurance policy. The convergence of military warnings, stalled diplomacy, escalating sanctions, suspicious fires, domestic unrest, and an American admiral at the negotiating table creates a picture of a region balanced on a knife's edge. Both sides insist they do not want war. Iran's officials, from the supreme leader to the foreign minister, have repeatedly stated they are not the instigators and do not seek to attack any country. Washington says it prefers a negotiated solution, but the actions on both sides are those of governments preparing for the possibility that diplomacy will fail. The pattern of events in recent weeks follows a trajectory that regional analysts describe as dangerously familiar. It mirrors the escalatory cycles that preceded previous conflicts in the Middle East, where military buildups, economic pressure, inflammatory rhetoric, and failed diplomacy created momentum toward confrontation that eventually became impossible to reverse. The difference this time, according to multiple assessments, is that the consequences of miscalculation are exponentially greater. Iran's military capabilities are more advanced than at any previous point. Its network of regional allies is more battle-tested, and the American military presence in the region is more exposed and dispersed across installations that Iran has openly identified as targets. Mousavi's warning was one of the strongest expressions yet of what Tehran believes failure could look like. Not a contained strike, not a limited exchange, a regional war with consequences for every country in the Middle East, every American military installation, every shipping lane, and every oil market on the planet. The question of whether